Reagan's defense secretary, Weinberger pointed to the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. And he said, now, who among the Soviets voted that they should invade Afghanistan? Maybe one, maybe 5 men in the Kremlin. Who has the ability to change that and bring them home? Maybe one, maybe 5 men in the Kremlin. Nobody else. And that is, I think, the height of immorality. And I think he's right, and I think, in fact, the founders felt that way as well. That's why that they viewed the decision for war as being one that went well beyond just the president as commander-in-chief to one for the Congress as a whole. James Madison explained that it's necessary to adhere to the fundamental doctrine of the Constitution that the power to declare war is fully and exclusively vested in the legislature. There was a change of wording from make to declare, but that was to allow the president to respond to attack, not to initiate a new conflict. And I would argue that the founders would not have spent the time they spent arguing about this phrase and writing it into the Constitution if it was merely a matter of semantics. The Congress could kind of declare a state of war existing that the president had started. The desire, in fact, was very clear. They wanted to make war less likely. The president is not safely to be entrusted with the power to decide on war, said George Mason of Virginia. He was in favor of, as he put it, clogging rather than facilitating war. And there was a number of discussions of this. We want to try to tie up the dogs of war. We want to make it more difficult to go to war. Because they'd all had basically looked at the experience of the king, and they weren't very happy with that experience. That their feeling was the king was too ready to resort to war. Thomas Jefferson wrote that, and in fact Alexander Hamilton agreed, both of them came together on this. Hamilton wrote, the president's power was in substance much inferior to those of the British king. He explained that in Federalist number 75, the history of human conduct does not warrant that exalted opinion of human virtue, which would make it wise in a nation to commit interests so delicate and momentous of this kind to the sole disposal of a magistrate created and circumstanced, would be the President of the United States. Jefferson and others made much the same observation. The desire then was to have a check upon the power of the President to go to war. They recognized that war was going to be necessary. Nevertheless, they wanted to make sure it was a decision that would be fully debated and would be decided upon by more than just one man. Now, the question of what kind of a conflict, would be declared by Congress, there's nothing in the Constitution about that. Congress has full discretion. Now, virtually everyone agreed the president could deploy the military defensively. They talked about, Roger Sherman of Connecticut said the president should be able to repel and not to commence war. But of course, repelling means repel. It doesn't mean invading other nations, initiating bombing campaigns against countries that have done nothing against you. There's a recognition that there is an important difference in terms of responding to an attack upon the United States or its forces than in terms of initiating conflict. Now, the presidents routinely have used the military over time. About 200 incidents throughout our history. Most of those are relatively small. It's only recently where presidents have claimed the right to make large-scale, sustained, long-term military commitments without Congress. A police action, for example, in Korea. Now, John Yoo and others have pointed out that the founders and the early generations were not themselves, hesitant to use the military, and he's right. Even Thomas Jefferson was willing to send naval squadrons to deal with the Barbary pirates. Nevertheless, they were quite insistent that they were talking about defensive as opposed to offensive actions. That George Washington, for example, said the Constitution vests the power of declaring war with Congress. Therefore, no offensive expedition of importance can be undertaken until they have deliberated on the subject and authorized such a measure. He was active using military against Native Americans, but it's unlikely he would have contemplated an attack upon other British colonies, absent a congressional declaration. Thomas Jefferson, when the issue came up before his cabinet on the Barbary pirates, their view was that they were responding to an attack on American vessels, but they would not have conducted offensive actions without a congressional declaration. Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin explained, the executive cannot put us in a state of war, but if we be put into that state, either by the decree of Congress or by another nation, the command and direction of the public force then belongs to the executive. So somebody else has to put us into conflict before we can take control, either Congress or another country will do so. Now, there are questions about, are there exceptions to this? No doubt. When we get into the international affairs, there are a few areas that are less, or that in many ways are more fact-bound and fact-laden than international relations. How large is the conflict? Have we been attacked? You get Tonkin Gulf, were we actually attacked by the North Vietnamese? Well, it turns out not, but the executive made the claim that we were. So some of these become very complicated issues. Nevertheless, the presumption certainly should be that wars, significant conflicts sustained with political ends, war should be declared by Congress and not decided upon merely by the executive. Now, the international law is becoming increasingly important. Now, I think, again, its relevance varies a bit based upon how strong one's nation is. Given the fact the United States is the dominant power on the planet, accounts for roughly half of all military spending on Earth, and has the most powerful military on Earth. We have 11 carrier groups, and there are 4 other carriers that exist in the world today. Our Navy is equivalent to that of the next 13 navies combined, 11 of which are from allied powers. Now, the U.S. is in a position to do pretty much whatever it wants, wherever it wants. So the feeling of limitation on a power like that, I think, is less. The same thing with Russia when it comes to a country like Georgia. Countries that feel the ability to use military power, and I would put China, I think, at some point in the future is going to be in this category, tend to be less concerned about the strictures of international law. I do think, however, that they are important, and what we see is a growing interest in places like Europe. The question about the international appropriateness of conflict, whether or not, for example, German troops should be in Afghanistan, it depends a lot. The Germans matters a lot whether or not there's United Nations authorization as opposed to simply an American-led operation. If you look at the UN Charter, which typically is the most relevant and most focused upon document when we think about international strictures, self-defense is allowed. It's not restricted. Article 51 says, nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual nations. An individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations. Now you're supposed to report to the Security Council and then it can take action. The charter also allows the existence of regional arrangements. This is a charter that was written as World War II was ending. So it was written in the context of the grand alliance between the United States, Russia, China, and Great Britain. There was a vision here in terms of how the future world was going to look like, but they allowed, you can have defensive alliances. Certainly today we'd be looking at that in terms of NATO and other alliances. Now, it also authorized UN action, however. Article 39 said the Security Council shall determine the existence of any threat to the peace, breach of peace, or act of aggression. And there's some interesting language about a military staff committee, the question of the responsibility of other countries to provide a military to the United Nations, provisions that really have never been acted upon. Nevertheless, there's been periodic discussion over the years about should the United Nations have its own military, a rapid deployment force, a fast action force that it could deploy in these situations. Typically, the United Nations, if it wants to intervene itself, can only rely upon member states. And in practice, what that means then is that member states have tried to use the United Nations for their own purposes. If one looks at UN military operations, they primarily occurred at the behest of the United States. You look at both Korea and Gulf War I. These were operations the United States wanted to undertake. It was very useful to have it formally as a United Nations operation. In Afghanistan, there are actually 2 separate commands. It's a very strange system, and it's not really the best system, but there's kind of a United Nations operation where many of the NATO allies operate under, and there's our own military operation. They are formally separate. Formally separate for legal reasons, and it matters an awful lot, particularly to the Europeans, being in the internationally sanctioned operation as opposed to the American operation. The real question comes, and this is, I think, where we're seeing an evolution of international law. It will be very interesting to see what happens in the future, is what happens when the Security Council is blocked. We saw that with Kosovo. We saw that with Iraq. That there's clearly a country can defend itself. You clearly can defend treaty allies. But what do you do? If you want to go to war, you can't get the sanction of the Security Council, but it doesn't fall under either of these defensive measures. And there, I think what we found is, until now at least, is basically the United States at least does what it wants, and Russia does what it wants. One can look at Kosovo, for example. There's no coherent claim of self-defense anywhere in there. Serbia had done nothing to the United States or any NATO member, posed no threat, utterly irrelevant in security terms to the United States. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein was a nasty guy. Pretty hard to make an argument that he substantially threatened America. Country of Georgia, pretty hard to argue that Georgia posed a significant threat to the Russians. If you look today at Iran and North Korea, now, you may make arguments of self-defense potentially in terms of Israel and Iran and South Korea versus North Korea. Much harder, I think, to make plausible self-defense arguments for the United States in terms of either of those. So the question is, what do you do in those cases? How do you get international legal sanction? Because in the cases of Georgia, Iraq, and Kosovo, of course, the major powers went ahead, went to war, and argued we can do it, or made a number of arguments. And there's an interesting area kind of humanitarian law that is being promoted under the argument of responsibility to protect. There's a paper on this back in 2005. There's been debate on that since. An argument that, at least in terms of kind of humanitarian disasters, trying to create a body of international law to allow one to intervene. The argument basically is, in certain ways, most fundamentally, to overturn very substantial doctrines of sovereignty, going back to the Peace of Westphalia and protected by the UN Charter, to argue that basically countries, governments have a responsibility to protect their citizens. If they fail in that, then they lose the protection of sovereignty. And then they are subject to intervention from outside. Now, that intervention should be only in the case of very serious violations of human rights, like the genocide, ethnic cleansing. It has to be something very substantial. That there have to be limitations on the right to intervene. They talk about precautionary principles of right intention, last resort, proportional means, reasonable prospects of success. And it has to be under the right authority. So first you go to the United Nations Security Council. If you can't get approval from them, then maybe you go to the General Assembly. And that can at least give you kind of moral authority. And if that doesn't work, maybe you can use regional organizations. But an argument for kind of setting up some doctrines that allow countries to intervene. So the idea would be whether it be Rwanda, Burundi, Liberia, Sudan, a number of countries who can come down on the list. And shall we open up much greater to this argument of humanitarian kind of intervention? So at the very least, on those cases, if self-defense is not involved, can you provide a legal justification internationally for intervention? And I think this is an area that one has to look at with a lot of concern. There's an upside in the sense that horrendous things happen in other countries. The desire to intervene is very strong. The downside is, if nothing else, the one advantage of the Peace of Westphalia, which kind of closed out the 30 Years' War, closed out a period of extraordinary bloodshed on Europe, was the idea of reducing war. That, sovereignty is messy. A lot of countries are ugly. Who wants to have Kim Jong-il in North Korea claim sovereignty? Nevertheless, the Pandora's box of war very often has more hideous things. The question of the ultimate consequences of societies where you ravage them by war and blow them up, it's very hard to know, what that's going to be. So if you create a doctrine that allows humanitarian intervention, you risk having more wars. That's the whole justification. It's the idea you can invade, you can kind of suppress, you can kind of recreate, reconstitute. And I think we have to recognize how easy it is to assume there will be humanitarian results, but in practice how often they aren't there. David Reef, for example, has in many ways changed his opinion about humanitarian intervention. He was a writer who was very focused on a number of these things, including the Balkans. But he looked at both Kosovo and Rwanda and came away saying, boy, a lot of bad came out of that stuff too. There's massive ethnic cleansing of Serbs by the Kosovars. Rwanda, there's an article in the New York Times a couple of days ago about the charges being made against the Rwandan government over its human rights abuses. That a lot of these things are not nearly as clean and easy and as simple as we would like. The fact that these sorts of powers will never be used without prejudice and without partiality. The reality is they will never be used against a large country. Nobody plans on initiating nuclear war with China to improve its human rights practices, even if China would be engaging in massive human rights violations. Nobody was prepared to go to war with the Soviet Union over murder of millions of its citizens. That these sorts of doctrines will only be useful against smaller countries. Smaller countries not allied with a great power. And I think we also have to recognize the temptation to use these to advance other ends. I would again point to Kosovo. Whatever one thinks of the whole Balkans problem, the United States had as its ally in NATO Turkey, supporting it in Kosovo. Turkey had engaged in years of warfare against its Kurdish minority, and up to 40,000 Kurds had died in that war. So if you're looking at which war is worse, which war have more people died in, we actually allied ourselves with the power that was committing greater human rights violations against another power that was 2,000 people over 2 years. Nasty, tragic, but in terms of guerrilla wars, this is garden variety. 250,000 people are dying in Liberia at the same time. What are the standards? So you can come up with legal standards allowing intervention, but the question is their application. Will any of the major powers actually follow anything close to objectivity in trying to use those standards, or are they more likely to basically use those standards to justify policies they would